All right, y'all. We are in the home run. We've got one more session. I know, like, some people are still trickling in, so just in the, I don't know, just keeping timing in mind. We're just gonna go ahead and get started and let folks trickle in. All right, our final session for today: voter access is power. We're joined by Denise Lieberman. Denise. I think so many of us in this room know who Denise is. She is an absolute powerhouse, right? A doer. She does not take no for an answer. Um, what, what do you wait? What was the first? Oh,
Oh, you open a can of whoop ass.
oh yeah. Oh yeah. Open a can. Whoop ass. Yes. Yes. Um, so I had the pleasure of actually first meeting Denise when I was a student at the Brown School, and she has just been, honestly, I don't even know if she knows this, but just like a mentor, right? I'm sure she's a mentor to so many of us, and just an example of how we should be showing up. Um, so Denise is the director and general counsel of the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, which is a nonpartisan statewide network of advocates who work to protect the rights to vote in Missouri. She is a nationally renowned expert on voting rights and has litigated challenges to voting laws all across the country in different states and, of course, including Missouri. She's also the faculty director of voter access and engagement at the Center of Social Development. Today, she was going to talk about a little bit about Missouri House Bill 1878 and what that has been since the passage of that, and how Missourians are now required to produce non-expired government-issued photo identification in order to vote. And what does that mean for us, right? So I will go ahead and pass the microphone to Denise.
Do I have again?
And we've got an hour, 4:15.
Okay, cool. We'll have plenty of time.
Thank you, Cherie. And please, can we now give it up for the Missouri State ID Access Coalition? This summit has been amazing. And I think Christine Christine is here. I think Sarah's outside dealing with the Left Bank Books people, because we have fabulous author Kat Calvin here who's going to be signing her books for y'all. You guys stick around for that, and especially happy hour. We've all earned that today, haven't we? Okay. So my name's Denise. I head the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, and I am joined here today by MOVPC's interns. I guess that is in real-time addition to the slide presentation. So stand up and hold up those posters that you have. Okay, stand up. He is a third-year law student at Washington University Law School. Max is heading to law school next year, and Natalia is a political science and sociology major at Washington University and a Gephardt Fellow, a member of the Student Senate. And we are really excited to have them all here. And sorry, Max didn't make the photo earlier, but anyway. The Missouri Voter Protection Coalition is Missouri's nonpartisan state voting rights table. We've been around since 2006. We actually were born of the photo ID effort. 2006 was the year that Missouri enshrined for the first time a strict photo ID requirement to vote. And we came together rather informally to oppose that and then to bring litigation, making Missouri also the first state in the country to ever find a photo ID requirement to vote unconstitutional. We won that case. So we thought that was going to probably be the end of it because we won. The court said it's unconstitutional. Clearly, we underestimated the Missouri legislature because these lawmakers who had to take an oath to affirm Missouri's Constitution, including our constitutional right to vote, upon finding out that a strict photo ID requirement is unconstitutional under our state constitution, didn't say, well, maybe we shouldn't try to pass an unconstitutional law. What they said was, well, then maybe we should change the Constitution. And they did. As you'll see, they didn't do a very good job of it. And fundamental right to vote in our state constitution remains intact, at least for now. We are now on round 4 or 5 of photo ID litigation in Missouri. Our case that is pending right now is headed to the Missouri Supreme Court. And one of the key issues will be whether or not Missouri's strict protection for our fundamental right to vote will remain in place. So we kept coming together. And after a few years, said, you know, we're doing a lot of defense here. And we were successful year after year. We staved off that photo ID bill. It didn't pass in 2007 or 2008 or 2009 or 2010. They finally passed a version in 2011 that would require this change to the Constitution. We filed a lawsuit, got that thrown out on grounds that it was misleading. They decided to call the constitutional amendment a voter protection bill. And we said, well, the Missouri Supreme Court has already said it does not protect voters. So we're going to call that misleading. So we kept getting together, and we are now kind of more formalized and very grateful for all of the coalition partners who are in this room who make this coalition what it is. And so today we have about 70 affiliated organizations across the state of Missouri who have, as part of their missions, efforts to protect the right to vote. And it is a very broad-based coalition because so many communities are marginalized in our fight for democracy. So many communities have voices that are left out. Our communities of color, our young voters, our seniors, our voters with disabilities, our LGBTQ citizens, so many others, English plus communities, voters with disabilities. And so our coalition represents a wide range of all of these folks. And we anchor 4 areas of work in Missouri. We anchor policy advocacy. So all that stuff you just learned about how to write testimony and testify, meet with your legislators. We anchor all of that work related to voting rights in Missouri. We keep a daily updated legislative tracker. We've already completed our strategic planning for the 2025 legislative session. And not only are we prepared to fight off yet again this year attacks on the citizen initiative process last year, which we successfully did, allowing the number of ballot initiatives that will appear on this November's ballot to pass by majority rule in Missouri this year, which would not have been the case had that bill passed. But guess what, y'all? We have affirmative legislation moving forward that I am extremely, I'll say cautiously optimistic that we can pass, including protections for poll workers. And you're not going to believe this, but it's true. Restoring voting rights for Missourians who are on probation and parole after they have served their time. Stopping efforts to place a citizenship marker on state IDs. We don't need more scarlet letters in this state, right? We're very excited about that work. We also anchor strategic litigation on voting rights in Missouri that we do alongside our state and national legal partners. Education and engagement. You have some of the palm cards that we help give out to voters at your tables there. And our flagship program, which is we run Missouri's nonpartisan election protection program. Natalia, stand up and show your shirt. This is a national program that helps ensure that no voter leaves a polling place without casting a ballot on election day. And it combines attorneys who answer calls into the 866 Our Vote hotline with this year will be thousands of volunteers we're going to need to staff polling places and help voters navigate their right to vote. You're going to see in a few minutes some pictures of some of you in this room who have done this work with us before, and we need this more than ever. We are, I was meeting with election officials in St. Louis County last week. St. Louis County says they're preparing for 65% voter turnout this year. It's not just because of a presidential election, but because we've got governor, we've got US Senate, we've got Congress, and we've got some really big ballot measures on the ballot this year. We're going to have high voter turnout. And we need to make sure everybody is able to cast a ballot. And in particular, for this space, we need to make sure that having an ID or lack of acceptable ID will not be a barrier for any voter being able to exercise their voice. Okay. So we are Big Tank, and if you want more information, you can go to our website. It's a little bit outdated now, but we're working on that, promise. Or text MOVPC to 66866. And so I want to tell you a little story about the history of how voter ID came to be the issue it is in Missouri, and then tell you, kind of give you some guidance on what you need to know and how you can help other voters cast a ballot in Missouri this year. Too often, the fight for voting rights is marred in political vitriol, right? Democrats versus Republicans, and you cannot turn on your television for 2 minutes anymore without seeing somebody screaming and evoking hate and divisiveness related to voting. When we come together, we have the power to reclaim the power of the vote as a moral imperative, as something everybody deserves to have. The late, great Congressman John Lewis said that the right to vote is precious, almost sacred. It is the most powerful, non-violent tool we have in a democratic society. And it is no coincidence that the attacks we've seen on voting rights have coincided with the uptick in vitriol and political violence that we have seen over recent years. One way we fight that is by ensuring that everybody is able to make their voice heard. Not just the few, but everybody. That it is an inherent right of each person to be able to have a voice in their own future. That's what voting is about. Okay, it's not about Democrats or Republicans. For you personally, it may be, but it is about the inherent right of all people to be able to make decisions about themselves in their own lives, right? And some of you may not know, and this is why I sort of ended up changing my presentation a little bit today. Missouri, as Kat, you said earlier, you guys in Missouri, there's something going on in Missouri. The truth is, yeah, we get overlooked by a lot of national organizations. And listen, I headed the voting rights program in a national organization for almost 15 years. And the only reason we were in Missouri was because I was like, hey, you got to keep Missouri is the canary in the coal mine for all of these issues. And Missouri has really been a long time flashpoint on voting rights. In fact, we were born from it. The Missouri Compromise, right, which brought Missouri into the Union, was rooted in Missouri coming in as a slave state and denying people the right to have a say and have a voice, have freedom, right? 1857, the Dred Scott case was tried right here in St. Louis, Missouri, just a few miles from where we are now. Many of you may not know this, but women's suffrage also has pivotal history here in Missouri, both with a important Supreme Court decision, Minor versus Happersett, where the United States Supreme Court held that women, while citizens, did not have the right to vote. On the flip side, in the Dred Scott case, what the Supreme Court said was, well, even if freed, Dred Scott is not a citizen entitled to the privileges and immunities of citizenship like voting. So you're not going to win either way, right? But we were the site of these historic court decisions. And another fun fact, the first women's suffrage organization in the country was right here as well in Missouri. And the League of Women Voters incorporated in Missouri in 1919, a year before the national office did, right? But you may not know this. Missouri is also the historic flashpoint of photo ID requirements to vote. And I know this because I was there. After the 2000 elections, some of you might remember, it seems like every election has been a contentious election lately, right? And at the time, we were like, oh my gosh, this is the craziest election ever. Right? Bush versus Gore. Remember the hanging chads? Remember the Supreme Court had to step in to decide the presidential election? Do you remember this?
Y'all probably don't.
But I do. And I also remember being the only attorney down at the St. Louis City Board of Elections that day when, like in several other states around the country, people were being turned away at the polls by the hundreds. Our case got a little overshadowed by another state, Florida, where this also happened. It just so happened that Florida's votes ended up being absolutely critical to deciding whether George Bush or Al Gore would be the president of the United States, that we didn't get all that attention. But it was just as bad. What had happened was the St. Louis City had purged over 50,000 almost entirely Black voters from the voter rolls. And so I was the only one there, and I didn't even have a laptop then. Right? I had like a pad of paper, and I was like an illegal pad. I was like taking notes while people were lining, and the lobby had swelled. No one could get through on the phones. And I was like, we got to do something. And I was the legal director of the ACLU in Missouri at the time. And I called our office assistant, who was a notary. I'm like, you need to get down here now, because we're going to need to file a lawsuit. And we did. We filed a lawsuit to keep the polls open that night because there were like 400 people in the lobby of the election board by like 3:00 in the afternoon on that November election day. Again, almost all of them African American, even though St. Louis City's voting population was 50% white, 50% African American. Why is it that only those who lived on the north side were getting purged from the rolls? Right? So we filed this lawsuit because I said, we haven't even gotten the post-work crowd yet. And at that time, you had to go to, and only to, your one exact polling place, or else you could not vote. And so what was happening was people were standing in 2-hour lines to get to the front to check in, right? To get to the front to check in, only to be told they weren't on the rolls, only to say, I've been voting here for 25 years. And they would say, go down to the election board. And that's how the lobby of the election board swelled to like 350 people that afternoon. And I was like, this is only going to get worse. And then once they fixed it, they would send them back to their polling place to wait in line again. And you all know there's a big push between that 5 p.m., 7 p.m. time at voting time. So I was like, we got to file a lawsuit. So we did. We filed a lawsuit. And at 4:55 p.m., and I'll never forget this actually, because it was taking people by this time 5 to 6 hours to get through the line at the election board to have their names reinstated. And so one woman I've been working with, who actually continues to be an advocate to this day, Mahina Nightsage, who was just a random citizen, had come there at 6 a.m. That's when she had been turned away from her poll. Came to the election board, finally got it back, and was able to cast a ballot by about 3:30 p.m. So she was the only one that actually made it through. And I was like, Mahina, I need you to come with me across the street to the courthouse. And she looked at me because she was in she was in 6 a.m. clothes, right? She was like in basically pajamas, like her hair was scruffled. And I was like, no one else can go. You need to be the face of this. So we get this injunction. We walk out of the courthouse. It's like 4:55 p.m. The 5 o'clock news comes on, and the headline is St. Louis voters have 3 extra hours to vote because of all this. And that night, some of you remember this, and of course, the state of Missouri filed an appeal that took some time. The Court of Appeals reversed it about 3 hours later, and we said, don't worry, everyone. And so at that time, Board of Elections locks the doors. All the people are standing outside, line around the block, because there's still like 300-something people that haven't been able to vote. And it's November, and it's cold. And we're like, don't go home. And they're like, I've been standing here like all day. And we're like, we're appealing to the Missouri Supreme Court. We're appealing to the Supreme Court. We're appealing to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court declines to take the case because they don't have to. And that is what ended voting rights that day. But that night, I'm blanking out his name now. Senator Kit Bond from Missouri. Anybody remember him? Right after, so the headline on the 5 and 6 o'clock news was, you've got 3 extra hours to go vote. You can vote until 10 p.m. Go do it. He gets on the news. Just today, we wouldn't think much of it, but at the time, he was like red-faced and screaming, like in a way that I had never seen a politician do before, talking about all the voter fraud that we had created in the city of St. Louis by advocating for these voters. And after that election, first of all, we then filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of all African-American voters in the city to challenge the practices that led to their disenfranchisement, led to a DOJ consent decree, and a brand new Board of Elections. But after that, after Missouri in that year, in Florida, in Bush v. Gore, and all of that, Congress came together and said, we need to put some guardrails on voting. And they passed, a couple years later, legislation that was known as the Help America Vote Act, 2002. And one little piece of that recommended, there was a commission called the Carter-Baker Commission that was co-chaired by Jimmy Carter, James Baker, bipartisan. And one of the recommendations in that did make it into the bill was to have voters show ID at the polls. And that is because Kit Bond and his friend at the time, Mitch McConnell, may have heard of him, they led a caucus to prevent passage of the bill, prevent passage of the Help America Vote Act unless voter ID was included in it. And it stemmed from that night in St. Louis in 2000. And that is why that measure is in the Help America Vote Act right now, despite some strong objections. But that didn't really impact, it didn't change things that much because that law allowed a range of forms of ID. And that's the law that Missouri implemented in 2002. The voters had to show ID, but it could be a voter registration card that you get from the election authority, a student ID, a document that a utility bill, a bank statement, etc. Then, a few years later, in 2006, Missouri became one of the first 3 states to pass strict photo ID requirements to vote, meaning that you couldn't use things like the voter registration card or the student ID or the bank statement, that only a Missouri driver or non-driver's license or federal ID that was non-expired would do. Missouri was the first state, along with Indiana and Georgia. Those 3 states passed these laws in 2006. I'm telling you, Missouri's got some skin in this game, y'all. The Indiana law was challenged under the United States Constitution, which, fun fact, does not include any affirmative protection for the right to vote. Did you know that? It doesn't. It went up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court upheld Indiana's law. Georgia's law, well, Georgia was subject to some provisions of the Voting Rights Act, called preclearance, that blocked implementation of voting laws that were seen as racially discriminatory. By the way, that provision is no longer in effect following a Supreme Court decision 11 years ago. So its law got blocked, and Missouri was the first state to challenge a strict photo ID law under our state constitution, which, like I said earlier, is one of a handful of states that contain affirmative protection for our right to vote. And our Missouri Supreme Court struck that law down and said it was unconstitutional. But here we are, doing it again. So I'm just going to whip through a couple little pieces historically to tie these efforts to require strict photo IDs to efforts we've seen throughout the past. You know, while America you know, pretends to be this great democracy. And in many ways, we have the promise of a great democracy. We've never actually realized that, right? We've always had a wide range of restrictions on who could vote, limiting the franchise largely to wealthy, white, property owning males. And even after passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, despite a brief period that we call Reconstruction, where, holy cow, think about this, guys. The states in the South, how do they make their money? On the backs of enslaved individuals. Those states in the South, once the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed, and by the way, they talked about adding women to the Constitution at that time, but everybody agreed that would never pass. So it was just Black men. But even with just the enfranchisement of Black men, 4 million new folks were added to the voter rolls or became eligible to vote. And in states in the South, whose economies relied on the backs of enslaved labor, guess what? Their populations were upwards of 40%, in some cases, nearly 50%. And so in that brief period of Reconstruction, progressive whites, low-income whites, and formerly enslaved men bound together, got elected to office. 16 African Americans in the United States Congress a decade after the Civil War ended. And well, over 900 African American state legislators. Think about this, right? And we can't have that because then they have power. And so the post-Reconstruction era was then marked by a very sweeping retaliation to stop those efforts. Race-neutral measures like literacy tests and poll taxes and grandfather clauses that said, well, you don't have to pass the literacy test because, there were also a lot of low literate white people. You don't have to pass the literacy test if your grandfather was able to vote. Well, if you were a formerly enslaved individual a decade after the Civil War, your grandfather probably wasn't able to vote. So all of these things were designed and good character laws, which were the precursor of today's felony disenfranchisement laws, which we still have here. And lawsuits were filed challenging these under these new 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, and in large part, they were upheld, right? The NAACP was founded based on these lawsuits, right? And they had a wide-ranging effect of practically eliminating the African American vote particularly in the South. You see just one example, Louisiana had over 130,000 registered African Americans on the rolls in 1896. 1898, they amended their constitution to add the literacy test and the poll taxes. 2 years later, they had fewer than 5,000 left on the rolls. And by a decade later, only 710. And that largely stayed the same until this is obviously the March on Washington, until the passage of the Voting Rights Act. So I told you that a decade after the Civil War, there were 16 African Americans in the United States Congress. Do you know how many there were in 1964, a century later, the year before the passage of the Voting Rights Act? 3. Okay, so these laws matter. You showing up and going to Jefferson City matters. These laws have a far-ranging effect. And of course, to get the Voting Rights Act took a lot. We're just coming off of the 60th anniversary right now of Freedom Summer from 1964, where, of course, 3 civil rights activists were brutally murdered on the very first day for going down to Mississippi to try to register people to vote, right? We have the actions of brave folks like former Congressman Lewis, who led that march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and was beaten within nearly an inch of his life by law enforcement officers. But that televised action did ultimately lead to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which we have just celebrated this 59th anniversary of, right? But this law has been gutted in recent years by a range of Supreme Court decisions that weaken their ability to block discriminatory voting laws. The Voting Rights Act was designed to enshrine the protections of the 15th Amendment into statute and to give the government an ability to block racially discriminatory voting laws. But they are now shells of their former self, right? And you might be wondering how this all applies to voter ID, and it has to do here. The modern and current movement around voter ID started with one election in 2008, the election of our nation's first African-American president, which brought out record numbers of young voters, record numbers of low-wage voters, record numbers of voters who lack a college education, and of course, record numbers of African-American voters. And those numbers are what turned states like North Carolina for Barack Obama. This is the genesis of modern day photo ID requirements to vote, because after the election of the nation's first Black president, 2 years later, we had midterm elections that resulted in what historians call a super red wave, where Republican supermajorities took over state legislative houses all across the country in that 2010 midterm election. Legislative sessions then began in January 2011. I happened to be the senior voting rights attorney at Advancement Project National Office in DC at that time. And I was the one that was leading, including for a whole coalition of voting groups, the tracking of statewide legislation on voting rights. And this was something that is very sophisticated now, but at that time was kind of in its infancy. And I was like, look at all these states that have this exact same strict photo ID bill. And guess what? I wrote a big report about it, and we were the first to identify this national trend of strict photo ID requirements to vote. The New York Times said so. So I tracked that. And of course, they were all rooted to a coordinated effort by the Koch brothers and the American Legislative Exchange Council, which said, if we are going to beat back leaders like him and others who might look like him, we are going to have to stop what happened in North Carolina. We're going to have to stop young people, low-income people, Black people, and people with disabilities from voting. And here's one way to do it. Here's a bill. And by the 1st of February, just a month later, I had tracked 34 states had introduced strict photo ID bills that year. And this was brand new. We had never seen sort of coordinated effort like that. All the bills looked exactly the same. And that's actually also what began kind of a national coordinated effort amongst voting rights groups that continues to exist today. And this was all before Shelby, right? So here in 2011, we had all these states that actually passed photo ID. All of these were photo ID laws, except for Maine's, I believe, that passed these photo ID laws in 2011. But thanks to the Voting Rights Act and a lawsuit that I filed in Wisconsin, that also under the Voting Rights Act, but a different provision, many of them did not go into effect. They were put on hold because of that preclearance provision of the Voting Rights Act. Okay, so Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, Pennsylvania case, actually I litigated that too. We brought that under their state constitution. And then the next year, in a case called Shelby v. Holder, the Supreme Court gutted that provision of the Voting Rights Act that resulted in all those red stars in all those states being unable to implement their voting laws. And guess what? I was there at the Supreme Court the day that it happened, and literally within minutes, the ink wasn't even dry when Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton got up and said, okay, now that photo ID law is in effect right now. The same photo ID law a judge had just ruled under the Voting Rights Act was racially retrogressive. And the other states followed suit. Okay, and that is the genesis of this big photo ID movement to vote around the country. Within less than a year, 3/4 of the formerly covered states under that provision of the Voting Rights Act had introduced restrictive voting bills, including North Carolina, which passed this monster voter suppression law that I was helping lead the fight to overturn. And they waited. They waited until after the court decision came down, and the legislators in North Carolina said they wanted to wait and see if the Voting Rights Act was going to be in effect before they passed it, because they knew the law would never have passed muster under the Voting Rights Act. So I got to be lead attorney representing Reverend William Barber, the North Carolina NAACP, and our lead plaintiff, Rosanelle Eaton, who was a plaintiff because her name, Rosanelle, was spelled differently on her underlying documents. She was over 90 years old, African-American, no records. Funny how this works, right? How systemic oppression lasts for generations. And at the time, she has passed away since then. But at the time, and this was a decade ago, she was 92. Guess what she didn't have as an elderly Black woman in the South? Yes, why? She was born at home, just like so many of my clients were, and typically born to midwives, and often birth certificates did not exist. Or if they did exist, they were often filled out by somebody who had very low literacy, because remember, also after the Civil War, it was illegal for African Americans to go to school. So often we're filled with errors, typos, wrong dates, etc. Rosanelle had to go to 10 different government offices just to get that. One, it was like Rosa was the first name, Nell was a middle name, Rosanelle as a full name on others. 10 different government offices to get all that reconciled. Our case went up to the Supreme Court, then back down, and became one of the biggest voting rights cases of the last decade, where the Fourth Circuit ruled that the law did violate the Voting Rights Act, targeted African Americans with almost surgical precision. I'm very proud because I wrote that language in our brief and the court used it. But cases like that were really the exception, and got more of the exception under federal voting laws. So we began moving back to looking at the states. Here in Missouri, that photo ID law was challenged in a case called Wangshank versus Missouri, where the court found that our strict photo ID requirement did violate the right to vote. And then, of course, like I said at the beginning, lawmakers then continued to try to change the Constitution rather than abide by it. Let's change it so that we can pass a strict photo ID requirement to vote. And they did. And that law went into effect in 2017. And I'm sorry, because Christine is standing right there in that picture, because Christine's been in this fight for a long time. It went into effect, and we filed a lawsuit in Missouri challenging that photo ID law. And you can see Christine was also a client on this, as well as another case called Priorities USA versus Missouri. So we went to court. Here we are at trial with the NAACP, and this was all before 2020, right? We got the state to agree to do a better job providing advance notice to people about IDs and giving people free IDs, which the law purportedly required. And then it got worse, right? The disinformation and the vitriol, the 2020 elections, the lies about the election results that fostered the deadly insurrection and attack on our nation's capital in January 6, 2021, led on by right here, also Missouri, I'm telling you, we're in it all. We are knee deep in the photo ID stuff here in Missouri. So that led to a historic uptick in new restrictive voting laws. So we had that first round after the midterm elections after Obama, and then we had a huge surge again in 2021. Over 400 restrictive voting bills introduced around the country that year, many of them to require strict photo ID to vote. And Missouri, of course, was right on that list again. And they introduced this piece of legislation, and it came through in the 2022 legislative session. And it maybe won't surprise some of you to learn that the legislative hearings were filled with a lot of patronizing, a lot of racism, and a lot of lawmakers. In fact, in this particular hearing, this is Kevin Windham, who is no longer in the legislature, saying it's a not so happy Black History Month in Missouri, House Elections Committee, where one of the legislative sponsors of photo ID requirements to vote purported to tell Representative Windham, who is African American, that African Americans like photo ID requirements to vote. Oh yeah, it's a good time. It's a good time in Moledge. So come down with us next year. Meanwhile, after the bill passes out of the Elections Committee and makes it to the floor of the House, State Representative Joe Adams, who this past year was the ranking minority member of the House Elections Committee and a former history professor, was getting black-splained on the floor of the House and interrupted as he began to speak us on this history that I'm just telling you about photo IDs. And they passed it. We tried really, really hard. We were up all night. Those filibusters were whew. And a deal got made that gave us 2 weeks of early voting, which is a good thing. And that is what ended the filibuster that allowed this law to go into effect. By the way, also then at the very last minute, they threw in 56 other pages of I'm not kidding. They threw in dozens more provisions that we're also now in court challenging. But this one is really the big one of this law. We immediately came together and said, now we're going to file another lawsuit. Seriously, when we showed up in court right after this, same Judge Beadham in Cole County, he was like, are we doing this again? It's same lawyers, same clients. Every single case is called NAACP versus Missouri, but it's 5 different cases, but they all challenge photo ID requirements to vote. And then we began to try and educate people in advance of the November 2022 elections on what is required. And what it did basically, and you tell me if this makes sense to you. So Missouri, what this bill requires, and this is the legislative language, a non-acceptable forms of ID to cast a ballot, a non-expired Missouri driver or non-driver license, a non-expired military ID, including veterans ID card, a non-expired passport, or, and this is the part that often gets left off of election authority websites, or another photo ID issued by the United States or the state of Missouri, which is either not expired or expired after the date of the most recent general election. So can you use an expired ID? It's either expired or not expired. I know that. Right. And that's the poster that the state put out in 2022. It's actually better than the one they had out during the last lawsuit. But clearly this does not indicate all of the forms of ID that you can show, right? And nowhere does it say that it can be expired. And then if you don't have a photo ID, you cast this special provisional ballot. Provisional ballots were a measure that was included in that Help America Vote Act of 2002 that I mentioned earlier. And the only way your vote will count if you don't have valid ID is if you fill out that envelope. We call blue provisional ballot because it's the envelope in which your ballot goes into. and it gets set aside. The back of the envelope is an affidavit, and you fill it out and you sign it. Your vote will get counted if either you go back to the polling place later that day with photo ID, which it might have worked if you're in the most recent August primary, the polls weren't all that busy. Maybe you just left it at home. But in the November general election, if you stood in line for an hour and a half, also if you don't have one of these forms of photo ID, or if a poll worker told you that you don't have one of these forms of photo ID, maybe wrongly, we heard some stories today about how even state officials don't really know what any of this means, you're not likely to go back.
And you have to reserve your call right a day ahead of give a disability and need call right. So you're not going back.
You're not going back. That's exactly right. The other way your ballot counts is if the signature on that provisional ballot envelope, which is now an affidavit, by the way, that is punishable. You're attesting under penalty of perjury, and if you lie on it, it is a class 3 election offense that can keep you from voting. If the signature matches the signature on your voter registration that's maintained by the election authority. Now, how many of you, well, probably not in this room, anybody here registered to vote online? And how did you sign that online voter registration application, Max? You have to sign a voter registration application. But if you're doing so online using like a tablet or smartphone, what do? We scribble. This one has to be filled out using what's called a wet signature. You sign it with a like actual pen. Do those signatures often look the same? No. In our lawsuit, which is actually still going on, challenging this version of the law, in fact, one of the state's largest, the election director for Jackson County, Missouri, which is Kansas City area, said she would never find that an online signature would match that signature. Never. She said, you may as well just throw them away. So we knew we had a lot of educational work ahead of us to explain these rules to voters. And of course, we work very, very closely with the ID Access Coalition to help make sure that we can do so. In essence, what this legislation did is eliminate forms of ID that people could previously use, like that voter registration card or even a student ID, right? So, Natalia, Tommy, you've got student IDs from WashU that you could no longer use. So this definitely affects students and it affects others who don't drive or don't have an ID. The cards on your table explain what these rules are. So we head to court. We had trial last November. We brought this suit along with the ACLU on behalf of the League of Women Voters and the NAACP. And And the trial really uncovered a lot of the barriers that you've heard about already today. So I'm going to whip through those pretty quick. But the hurdles to getting ID, you have to provide proof of identity, like a certified birth certificate. Not a copy, can't be the copy, certified. I took my 93-year-old mother to get her, because her driver's license is expired, thankfully. She's 93, does not need to be driving, but all the information is totally accurate. Same name, same address, same everything. She can use it when she goes to the doctor. She can use it when she goes to the bank. Took her to get a state ID. Her birth certificate doesn't have her name that she uses on it. She actually has it. She had her original Social Security card. Okay. Like, she's not, yeah. So this is somebody that is super, super organized. I think she has mine too, because that is like, she's like so much more organized than I am. You have to provide lawful status, proof of your Social Security number, and Missouri residency. And for all the reasons you heard today, these are real barriers. And while the state is required to provide one form of non-driver ID to Missouri voters, and also provide underlying documents like a certified birth certificate if you need it. But again, if people like Rosanelle Eaton don't have it, what are you going to do then? Right? And I can tell you stories about what people have done to try and find these things in the past. The key here, though, is, and this came out in the trial very well, that There's no signage at Missouri motor vehicles offices about the ability to get an ID without cost. None. And you have to say the magic words. So if you show up, and unless you say, I am specifically here to get a no fee ID for voting, I need it for voting, you won't get it for free. And, you know, JMO and others, you talked earlier about, you know, people are like, hey, you know, I need this to get an apartment. Like, I need this to get my benefits. Like, you need it for all kinds of things. There shouldn't be this sort of hurdle that people have to jump over, especially since there's nothing explaining that process at motor vehicle offices. And some motor vehicle offices are like, yeah, no, I just don't think I don't like that. I'm not doing it. With my mom, we got one of those nice ladies at the Olivet office because my mom looks like a sweet little like Ruth Bader Ginsburg looking lady. She's like 4'7" and 75 pounds. And, you know, she had like, we brought her marriage license because, of course, if your name has changed since birth, that's why these laws also disproportionately impact women. You need to demonstrate those legal documents. She was married in a Jewish temple, no actual marriage license. So she brought her ketubah, which was in Hebrew. And the lady was like, I don't know what this thing is. So in short, while the law sort of purports to cover everybody, and that's what our Secretary of State likes to say, they do a very bad job of it. And that came out, I think, very well, strongly in our trial. In addition, this affects a lot of people. You hear proponents say, oh, come on, like, this doesn't affect anybody. And I struggle with this a lot because as someone that does a lot of media, you know, I'm always being asked, hey, bring all these people that don't have photo ID. And it's like, these people are struggling to survive. These people are trying to figure out where they're going to sleep at night. These people are figuring out how they're going to get to their doctor's appointment or how they're going to be able to afford their inhaler. Like, no, they're not driving to Jefferson City 2 hours away in the middle of a Tuesday to like tell their story. And so it's very hard to make people sort of to humanize this process, which is why I'm going to end with this short video. In Missouri, we have data. Guess what? We have data. Over 220,000 Missourians, and these are rough numbers because obviously at any moment in time the voter registration rolls change, right? Maybe one of you is going to update your registration with me for today, for example. Somebody dies every day, right? Somebody moves every day. But at this point in time, what we did was, or what the Secretary of State did, because this is the Secretary of State, Jay Ashcroft's own numbers. Okay, this is not inconsequential numbers. What we did was we took the voter rolls, the list of all the registered voters in Missouri, sent it to the Department of Revenue, which maintains all of the motor vehicle records, and then match names, match birth dates, match addresses, all right, to see how many people who are registered to vote lack a Missouri ID. Guess what? It's a lot. Over 137 registered voters did not have a state ID at all. Another 140,000 had one that was expired. We don't know how it expired because it can only be recently expired, right? So we're talking almost 300,000 people who are on the list of registered voters. And all of those barriers are the precise reason that the court in 2006 said that these kinds of laws burden the right to vote, because you can only get the kind of ID that you get at the DMV or a federal ID like a passport. And while our friends next door are helping people get passports and paying for them, we all know that it is extremely expensive to get a passport and difficult to do so. Statistically, it's like less than 1% of people with IDs have the passport. Right, that's going to fall mostly on privileged individuals, not people that don't have a state driver's license, right? And this is Kathleen Weinshank. Actually, she was the plaintiff in that case. She had cerebral palsy, couldn't sign her name, and so that's why she couldn't replicate her signature. Which is why that provisional ballot thing that is supposed to save the people that don't have IDs wouldn't work for her. She doesn't drive because she has seizures. She has actually since passed away as well, but she was extremely politically active, actually also a member of the League of Women Voters. And the court recognized that those barriers can be really significant. I have to say this was after a very long day of trial. But the value of these coalitions is really powerful because both Christine and Sarah, on behalf of the ID Access Coalition, the North City ID Clinic, and of course, St. Francis Xavier's ID Clinic, testified about the real people that they encounter and told actual stories of real people and the barriers that they faced. And that testimony was extremely compelling, so compelling that the state tried to exclude all of their evidence from coming in of the guests that they had surveyed at their clinics. But the numbers really are quite powerful, right? And you see that the people who lack state IDs are disproportionately people of color, are disproportionately housing insecure, unhoused, disproportionately lack access to transportation, are disproportionately low income, right? And Missouri, like a number of other states, has also made it very difficult to access these DMV offices. In the city of St. Louis, we only got 2. They closed the one office that was located on a public transportation route in City Hall. The one office that was actually in a building that had other government offices in it. So the work that is going on here is really critical. We brought in expert witnesses who testified that voter fraud, especially voter impersonation, is virtually non-existent. We brought in experts like Professor Mayer of Wisconsin, who looked at the rates of those provisional ballots and all of them that went uncounted in 2022 because of a lack of signature match. We brought in a handwriting expert to show that election officials are ill-equipped to even judge those signature matches. And here we are at trial. And so what you need to know, unfortunately, here's where things stand after trial. The case is not over. There's no ruling. We haven't even finished closing arguments. We have to come back in a month to do closing arguments in the case. And then write a post-trial brief. I actually think that Judge Beadham is probably going to rule against us on this case, because he has before. He usually finds our clients lack standing. That's a whole different lecture. And then we're going to appeal to the Missouri Supreme Court, where hopefully the Missouri Supreme Court will uphold that same ruling from 2006 and say that our Constitution undeniably protects the freedom to vote. Until that time, this law is in effect. It will be in effect for November 5th. Let me say that again. The photo ID law will be in effect for November 5th. You will have to show a state or federally issued photo ID that expired, that is either not expired or expired after November 8th, 2022. So it can be recently expired. Take these palm cards. I have a huge bin. I've got about 2,000 of them in my car right now. Take them, okay? Remind people if they do have to cast that provisional ballot to sign it. If it's not signed, their ballot will not be counted. So please help train them on that. Look to us if you have any other questions about this. There is a new regulation that just came out by Secretary of State Jay Ashcroft this summer, saying that you can no longer use a digital image of your photo ID. In 2022, that was allowed in some places, like at Washington University, where there are a lot of out-of-state college students. And some of you may have college-age children, or at one point had college-age children. Did you send your college-age child off to college with their passport in hand? No. Just like my mom still has my social security card, right? So in 2022, college students were, and others who maybe had a passport but not a Missouri ID, were able to show a digital image of that ID. Well, that clearly is enfranchising too many young people. So Secretary of State Jay Ashcroft issued a regulation this summer saying that it has to be plastic. We still don't know what that means for people that have to renew those IDs right before Election Day and get that piece of paper. He says, oh, no, that'll count too, except that the word actually says plastic. So I'm a lawyer. I know things, words matter sometimes, but it cannot actually examine your appearance. So I have the photo ID anyway. And you can, of course, cast a provisional ballot. So things you can do right now. Here's my call to action, and then Cherie is going to come up and really call you to action. We need to educate people, because what we know is that both voters and poll workers don't know these rules. Okay, and let people know that that's okay. A lot of people don't have any idea that these services to provide free ID are available. So here are materials. We have them here. Take some with you today. We have them also in Spanish and Korean. This is from the last election. Telugu, Hindi, Bosnian, Arabic, Chinese, Swahili. That's because we have a language access committee. We also have an accessibility committee. So I want to give a shout out to Vince Highholt. We do a lot of work to ensure access for voters with disabilities as well. And register to vote, help people register to vote. The deadline's October 9th. 1 in 4 eligible. Yeah, there you go, Cammie. We've got voter registration right here. If you need to update yours, if you've moved, you need to update it. 1 in 4 people are not registered to vote who are eligible to do so. And guess what? That also doesn't fall across the community. 88% of, or 85% of white people, eligible white people, are registered to vote. Only 66% of eligible Black people are, and only 54% of eligible Hispanic people are registered to vote. So, okay, see, we got some people in this room right here. Felicia, Sabrina, get out there and do some voter registration. See, that's why I added some new slides after I came here. I was like, oh, I gotta. And keep in mind that the voter registration restrictions that were also snuck into House Bill 1878 are not in effect. We are in court on those right now too. We have an injunction. Those are not in effect. That means that anyone can register voters in Missouri. You can get paid to do so. The only issue is if you are getting paid, you do have to complete that solicitor form. Other people do not. You do have to have an address listed on your voter registration card. If you are if you work with people who are unhoused, it can even be a the park at 18th and Vine, but it can also be one of the social service agencies that that Christine talked to you about earlier. Finally, join us, Election Protection. It's our biggest flagship program. We are going to need over 1,000 volunteers this November to help make sure everybody is able to cast a ballot. We have like an over 90% success rate. When people call the Election Protection Hotline, we actually are able to help them vote. Because attorneys like Vincent, who've been doing this forever and ever, are there. We get on the phone with the election directors right away. We get the issue fixed. But the only way we can help them is if they call. So please help spread the word. We have those little postcards, the little cards. Oh, there's more Sabrina. And there's interns that you met today. By the way, if you met any of our interns, you get to knock off one of your bingo squares. So please join us. Get the word out, get the word out, get the word out. There's more information about voter ID. And finally, we also support federal legislation to help ensure the right to vote. Can I show the video is only like a couple minutes long. And I'm gonna end with that. Aggressively loud.
My name is Joy Lieberman. I live in St. Louis, Missouri. I voted in every election since 1952. I believe that's 60 years. My involvement with education was almost accidental. I'm not a teacher. I'm not an educator. I was a very active parent, and when the school district was going through a very traumatic time, I figured, hey, I'll submit myself for this. They won't choose me. And they did. And I spent 24 years on the Board of Education.
My name is Emmanuel Aziz. I live in St. Louis, Missouri. I've been a registered voter since the early 80s. Okay, the poster on the wall is of me playing with my band, the Son of Star Child Band. And we had an opportunity to play a lot of places and open up for a lot of people. First started off playing drums when I was a kid, and eventually I made it to the front mic, and I am a front man, as you can see. Cheese.
Well, there's a problem on my birth certificate. The name everyone knows me by, Joy Lieberman. Joy is not my first name, and it's not on my birth certificate. And I discovered that when I was in my mid-40s, thought nothing of it. It was a non-issue until this whole matter of photo IDs reared its head. And I realized that the next time I have to renew my driver's license and present this birth certificate, I'm going to be in big trouble, probably not able to vote.
Everybody's got something they got to go through in life, something that they have to deal with. And my test happens to be multiple sclerosis. I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in 2006, I believe. Some people can't get a state ID because they're in a nursing home like myself. And sometimes you're not able to just get up and get in your car and just go get your ID. You pretty much need to get help. Everybody who's disabled should be a registered voter and being able to vote.
My parents were the first generation in each of their family to be born here. And I'll tell you, they impressed upon me how important it was to vote. And when I thought my right to vote was going to be infringed upon, I was furious. This country fought a war so we wouldn't be taxed without representation. Now, if I lose the right to vote, will the state of Missouri deny my taxes? I don't think so.
Voting means a lot to me because of the fact that my voice is being heard. And I believe that everybody should be able to have their voice heard.
I am an American citizen. It's my right and my duty to participate.
Just because I'm in a wheelchair doesn't mean I can't stand up for my right to vote.
This is your country. You deserve a say-so into who's governing it and how it's being governed.
No matter what.
Against any odds.
November 6th, I'm voting.
November 6th, I am voting.
Just a decade ago,